start today a 3-week journey, a journey that is going to take us into Easter. Now, this idea of a journey taking us to Easter is actually, it's nothing new, right? For many Catholics or many Christians, this is a journey that has already begun this year, Lent, right? The 40 might feel like that, but it's a 40-day journey leading up to the Thursday before Easter. And, this is an ancient practice, although recently there has been some attempts to kind of revamp Lent. For example, last year, there was an attempt to kind of rebrand Lent as Mark Wahlberg's 40-day challenge. But nonetheless, this is an ancient journey and progression. And the idea of resurrection, not as simply a destination, simply something that happens out of nowhere, but actually something that is a journey and a movement and a process. This is a very powerful idea. It's also not an idea that is exclusive or belongs to Christianity, right? So if you didn't come up in that tradition, or that story isn't one that is as familiar to you, I hope that there is no barrier for you throughout this series in experiencing and participating in this symbol of resurrection. Because I do not believe that resurrection needs to be a dogma, needing to be something that we need to believe in order to find belonging, but that resurrection is actually a pattern. It's a pattern that we can see all over the place. We see it in nature. We see it happening in our own lives, right? And it kind of goes like this. It's pretty simple. Life, death, resurrection, right? We all kind of understand this innately. But fill in the blank and you'll see it showing up all throughout our lives and experiences. Of course, it shows up in nature, but it also shows up as we develop as humans. We go through difficulties, and it kind of shows up like this. There's life as we know it. There's the status quo. There's things as usual. And then we experience some sort of death. Maybe it's a literal death, or maybe it's a symbolic death of something, a loss, a change, a disruption. And then on the other side of that, if you stick with it, what we might find is that there is a resurrection. There is a surprise of something new life born out of the old, a phoenix rising from the ashes, right? And this shows up all over the place. It shows up in small ways, and it shows up in big ways, right? Think about, for example, just something that happens pretty much every year, right? A life, death, resurrection cycle that happens every single year, or at least what feels like annually. And we're probably all thinking of the same thing, right? The McRib. We are given the McRib, right? And then all of a sudden the McRib disappears. It goes away. There's a death experience there. And then out of the blue, sometimes just in complete surprise, the McRib returns to us, and it feels like a resurrection. Right? Or how about this? About 10 years ago, we were told that Twinkies were going away forever. I don't know if you remember this, but Hostess went bankrupt. So there was the life that we know of Twinkies being available at grocery stores. And then one day we're told, no, Twinkies are going away forever. And there was a lot of mass panic. And then 8 months went by where there were no Twinkies available. And then all of a sudden, what happened? Hostess got bought by a larger company. Twinkies came back. Life, death, resurrection. One more. The mullet. In the 80s, there was a hairstyle known as the mullet, right? Popular. Many people's wedding photos. How many of you have a mullet in your wedding photo, right? If we're being honest. Okay, no one's being honest. But the mullet, right, had a life, right? And then the mullet went away. But I'll tell you something. The mullet is back, people, okay? And I know that when you look at me, you might not describe what I have as a full mullet, or a fullet, as we call it in the biz, but the mullet is back, right? And it's finding its way back into modern culture. So there's always this life, death, resurrection cycle, right? And it shows up, of course, in all seriousness, in some major ways. Of course, it shows up in nature. Take, for example, if you remember the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, right? Complete ecological devastation to the surrounding area. But, that was in 1980. So all this time has passed, and look at what Mount St. Helens looks like today, right? It has recovered. There is a phenomenon known as ecological resurrection. And in fact, Mount St. Helens is one of the most studied and researched sites for this phenomenon, to see how nature always bounces back and finds a way. Or how about this? Sometimes life, death, resurrection is built into the DNA and blueprint of an organism, right? We have these giant sequoia trees, which are so large that right now we're looking at maybe not even a third of these trees, right? And you can still see their magnitude. And in fact, what's so fascinating about giant sequoias is that their seeds are only released when there is a forest fire, when they are exposed to fire. So there's something in the DNA of these trees that says that it's only when exposed to a death experience that resurrection and new birth approaches. And of course we have every year, right, and the seasons to show us the life, death, resurrection cycle, of which right now we are in the middle of the resurrection portion with spring. But of course we also see this in our own lives. We go along with the status quo. Things are operating as normal. And then there is a change. There is a loss, right? There is some sort of major disruption that shows up in our lives. And we have these experiences of disorientation, trying to find our way, grief, panic, whatever it might be. But generally speaking, on the other side of those experiences, some version of a new life, a new way of seeing things, a new experience, a new understanding finds its way, and we might call this resurrection. And this also shows up in the collective, in our experience as a species, as a society. How many of us feel that on some level there is something dying, right, in our world? It's hard to name, but it's something we are grieving together. And yet, we might also have hope that there is something potentially being reborn on the other side. So I find it incredibly helpful to look at this pattern, to look at this cycle, because we might be able to find ourselves in this cycle. Where am I? Where are you in this life, death, resurrection cycle? You might be in in some kind of experience in life in which you're experiencing some sort of death, right? A loss of something, a change. You might also be experiencing in another area of your life, in another aspect of your human experience, you might be experiencing some birth, something being reborn. It is very plausible that you could be experiencing these two things simultaneously, right? And so throughout this series, we're going to explore each stage, right? And today we're going to be exploring that first stage, and we're going to be exploring it using, selfishly, my favorite image of the life, death, and resurrection cycle, which is the movement from the caterpillar into the butterfly. So this series is called The Caterpillar and the Butterfly, because these two beings, right, these two creatures, they are the same, but they are also not, right? They ultimately share the same soul in a way, but they are vastly different creatures. Because as the caterpillar moves from caterpillar to cocoon to butterfly, it ultimately ends up as something quite unrecognizable from its original state. It faces its own death, essentially, in order to transform into something quite different. Author Richard Bach describes this tension, what the caterpillar calls the end of the world, the master calls a butterfly. What I like about this quote is it alludes to the fact that it is really about our own perceptions, right? Our own eyes. Are we willing to see a butterfly when it feels as though what we are facing is an ending, right? Are we willing to see what others might not be willing to see in a situation? And we can start right with the caterpillar. The caterpillar who, is doing its caterpillar thing, right? It's eating, it's growing, it's shedding its skin. But what's interesting is inside the caterpillar, there is something called imaginal cells, as in imagination, imaginal cells. And these cells actually hold the blueprint for the butterfly. There are cells within the caterpillar's body that are essentially butterfly cells, and they have not been activated yet. They are hints at what is possible. They are a vision or a glimpse of the caterpillar's future potential, but they are not yet active. And then something happens. At a certain point, hormones trigger the caterpillar's metamorphosis. And in that moment, it's caterpillar life, right, of eating and growing and enjoying having how many legs it has, whatever, right? That part of its life is over, and it begins to weave its cocoon. And then, in the cocoon, enzymes break it down so deeply, so completely, so absolutely, that even scientifically, when they describe the state of the caterpillar in the cocoon, the best word that they can come up with is soup, essentially. Next time you're eating soup, just think of our friend the caterpillar. You're welcome. It'll come back to you. But then what happens? Ultimately, the caterpillar is reborn as a butterfly, right? Where it has all these new capacities and faculties that it did not yet have, right? It can fly, for one. Its senses are far more acute and finely tuned than ever before as a caterpillar, right? Every one of its senses is a lot more sharp. It has this ability to navigate over very long distances and essentially see much more of the world. It has a vastly different nervous system. It has the ability to mate, which it didn't have before. I'm sure that's exciting for it, right? And so ultimately, as a butterfly, there is this vastly new experience happening for what was once the caterpillar. And yet when we talk about this, I know for many of us, we're thinking, yeah, we know this. We've seen a caterpillar. We've seen a butterfly before. But I just want you to notice something here, okay? There is a blueprint that exists within the caterpillar, hidden in those imaginal cells, that can only come to light and can only come to fruition when the caterpillar faces its death experience or its death process. And in the same way, I think for us as human beings, we come to these moments which feel like an ending. Maybe it's the loss of a job, something that happens that really calls into question a particular identity, a sense of security you might have had. And yet, it is only going through that process that there is the activation of something dormant and hidden within us. That I believe as human beings, we were always meant to fly, so to speak, right? We were always meant to live into the full experience of what's possible, a higher sense of awareness, of compassion, of love, of connection. And yet maybe that's only there for us on the other side of letting go of the known. Right? Talk about faith. If the caterpillar does not follow this process, if the caterpillar resists the call into the cocoon, it ultimately will die without becoming all that it could have been. And in the same way, friends, I think there are areas of life that we all have where if we do not recognize, hey, I'm in the caterpillar stage in this area of life, then we don't get to experience the fullest potential. We don't willingly go to the cocoon, and then we don't get to see the butterfly on the other side of it. See, there are areas in life, sometimes we think we are the butterfly, when in fact we are still the caterpillar, and that's okay, right? If you've ever gone to therapy, you probably have had this experience where you think, I'm good, life's good, I have things figured out, and then you sit in that chair and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, it's not as I thought, I have a lot of work to do. I thought I was flying, but I am still on the ground. In spiritual terms, you might think of this in terms of freedom, right? I thought I was so free, and it turns out I'm still quite stuck, right? There's a mystic who lived in the 18 and 1900s named Gurdjieff, and he said this pretty well-known quote. He said, if you wish to escape from prison, the first thing you must realize is that you are in prison. If you think you're free, no escape is possible. And essentially, he's really talking about our own spiritual experience of life, that if we think we are free And yet we are not. We're not going to get to experience the release and the escape and the movement and the transition into something greater if we don't sit down and really get honest with ourselves about where we are in certain areas of life. Then we'll never experience where we could go. So what are the ways in which you might not be free? Right? If we can't admit that to ourselves, if we can't admit that in some areas of life we are still caught in a dream, then how are we going to wake up? What is that for you? Right? Maybe it's emotionally. Maybe there are just some things in which you're stuck, some areas in which you have some things that are holding you back, maybe unforgiveness, looking back at a situation and saying it should not have gone that way, or looking at a relationship and wishing it functioned differently. Friends, it's very understandable that we would avoid and resist the escape or waking up or transformation, because these things require letting go of the known. And often as human beings, we prefer a familiar stuckness or a familiar dysfunction rather than actual change. Right? Thich Nhat Hanh, he puts it this way: people have a hard time letting go of their suffering. Out of a fear of the unknown, they prefer suffering that is familiar. Sometimes there's pain and there's dysfunction and there are cycles that we get trapped in. And sometimes for us, it becomes an identity where we don't even know who we are without it. Maybe this is something you can relate to. Maybe you know someone who exhibits this. But here's the reality. Sooner or later, there will be a call from within, and that invitation to let go of who you think you are, so the imaginal cells, the greater potential, the greater possibility of who you've always been, right, can come through and can come forth. And in many ways, this is the purpose of the caterpillar, to move courageously into its own death so there can be a resurrection. Spiritual teacher Osho says the caterpillar dies and the butterfly is born. Death and resurrection are two aspects of the same process. To die is to be reborn. To die to the old is to be born to the new. Now, here's what a caterpillar cannot do. The caterpillar cannot skip this experience, right? The caterpillar can't look around and go, oh, wow, these butterflies look like they're having so much fun. I want to be like one of them, but I really don't want to go into the cocoon. So maybe here's what I'll do. I'm going to just try to fashion myself some wings and see if I can learn to fly on my own. It's a kind of a cute image, but it doesn't work, right? And in the same way, friends, you and I, we cannot bypass this part of our journey. We can either go through it or avoid it altogether, meaning resisting it, putting it off, and never getting to experience the fullness on the other side. When we are given the invitation and the opportunity to move into a larger consciousness or a larger awareness or a deeper, fuller understanding of life, or a bigger well of love opening up within ourselves, and we are given this opportunity to expand, on some level it is always going to mean a death of sorts for the smaller self, which is why words like surrender and phrases like letting go are so commonly used in these contexts, right? In a sort of spiritual context, because we are always being invited to surrender and to let go. We simply cannot transform in this way and also take with us all of these aspects of our smaller self, right? Like you can't transform and take bitterness with you, or take a lack of forgiveness with you, or take this greed, or take this hate, because you can't fly with these things weighing you down. So when life shows up out of nowhere and smacks us over the head, which it will do, spoiler alert, right? You're going along one day and then all of a sudden, goodbye job security, right? Or goodbye this identity I had in this particular relationship, or goodbye this sense of stability that I had in my health. And all of a sudden, you are being invited into two things. You can either resist what is happening, or you can begin to see it as part of a larger process and begin to weave your cocoon. I want to zoom out for a second because we are talking about our lives as caterpillar lives. But I also want to recognize that in some ways we are living in a caterpillar society. We are all caterpillars. And because our society, our structure in which we've lived and operated has existed a particular way for a very long time. So long that we have come to accept it as normal. We have come to accept a status quo, often without questioning, what if there is a better way for us to be human together? What if as a collective there are imaginal cells waiting to come through and show us who we always have had the potential to be? And perhaps to get there, we as a society, as a world, need to be willing to enter a cocoon of sorts and to let go of the known. Now, there are some of you out there, probably many of you, who desperately hope that, yes, there is a better way to do things as a species, right? There must be a better way for us all to be human, because what we're currently doing does not seem to be working, right? That some of us out there, we look at what we're experiencing in the world today and you feel despair. And that is an appropriate response, right? There are probably those of you who not only feel that, but you feel an incredible sense of urgency. Like this resurrection that you're talking about, we need it fast. Also an appropriate response. And certainly there are many of us who are just unsure what exactly would it look like for there to be this rebirth on this grand of a scale. But before we get there, I think what's important to recognize that if we start thinking not just of our own lives, but of our collective experience as humans in terms of transition, in terms of transformation, in terms of this movement from caterpillar to butterfly, perhaps it starts to free up some energy that we have so invested in looking outside of ourselves and fighting the external. We can start to look within and be willing to engage this journey within. See, friends, whatever political figures or political ideology that you look at today and you go, okay, that's the problem. That's the one and only problem. I promise you that our process as human beings of transformation, our movement into the cocoon as a species is bigger than any one political figure or one political ideology. Now, don't mishear me. I'm not suggesting that we ought not to be engaged in our world, right? We ought not to engage in things like protest. And, I think it's very important that we do all these things. But in addition to the civic engagement that so many of us are currently involved in, I also know that you come to a place like this for an additional perspective, an alternative perspective, a spiritual perspective. And for me, this is what I hope to offer today. That in the grandest scale that we can possibly imagine, humanity is a bit lost, right? Maybe quite a bit lost, and we've been lost for some time. And last week, we talked about maybe one of the reasons, one of the explanations of how we got so lost being our disconnect to the planet and our lack of connection to that which sustains us in any given moment, and that disconnection really feeding into all these other areas of our lives. And another reason why we've gotten so lost, so far away, is that we've invested all this energy and all this belief and all this power into systems that in many ways are quite far from our highest potential. That we've invested so much power in caterpillar systems when there's something greater for us, right? Like, do we think that healthcare and the medical system got corrupt overnight? Right? Or do we think that the food system and all the food we eat just got toxic 5 minutes ago? Right? If we're honest with ourselves, things like the justice system, things like the workforce, economy, education, there have been inherent systemic issues in these things for decades, even centuries. Right? We talk a lot about, religion and perhaps the crumbling of religious institutions here. And what we've traced and looked at is that these things have been corrupted and perhaps crumbling for millennia. Or we look at something like industry and the harm that industry has been causing to the earth, right? Do we think that that is brand new? The point I'm making, friends, is that we are long overdue for a quantum leap in consciousness. This isn't something that is recent. We are long overdue. And so I invite you to take some of that energy that we've been spending, right, fighting this loss. Not all of it, because of course we need to address real systemic injustices in our world and in our sphere right now. But just take some of that energy that we've been using and putting towards despair, and perhaps we can start to redirect that energy into weaving our own cocoon, right? To getting our caterpillar, say that 5 times fast, getting our caterpillar affairs in order, right? And weaving our cocoon and seeing ourselves as part of a transformation. Friends, I don't want to downplay the urgency and the intensity of the political moment we're in, but I also want to emphasize the spiritual moment we're in. So let's come back to us for a second. Where in your life are you being invited into the cocoon? And what is happening for you there? Are you resisting? Are you ready? Are you perhaps somewhere in between the two? See, friends, I believe it's places like this, it's in spiritual community, where we begin to figure out together what it means to weave our own cocoons and hold space for each other to become the butterflies that we're meant to be on the other side, because there is support and love and understanding in a space like this. The very first message I gave in person at Aldea was called Aldea, a Transformational Community. And I used this image of the caterpillar and the butterfly because what I could sense, even coming in here after this community had already had a long, beautiful journey, what I could sense is that this has always been a community that was not simply about upholding the status quo, but inviting people into transformation. And I believed that we would continue down that path, and we have. But you might be out there saying, well, I just don't know if I have enough energy to continue to transform, to keep evolving, to keep changing, and how painful that is because of all that I need to let go. You might say, I don't even know if I have enough hope to say that if I were to do these things, if I were to transform, that it would even make a difference, that it would even be worth it on the other side. It is very natural to be so discouraged and so overwhelmed that we don't know and we don't have enough motivation to even move forward in this journey. But I'll close with this, and it's a bit of a hint at what's to come in this series. And it's a quote from Mary Oliver: "Keep some room in your heart for the unimaginable." Keep some room in your heart for the unimaginable. Now, this is a hint at what's to come because it's a reminder, friends, that resurrection is nature's greatest surprise. It's life's greatest surprise. And it's something that we can only experience if we show up and we engage in the processes that are so difficult and so challenging, that feel like endings. And if we show up and we still believe that there is some unimaginable new beginning on the other side. So I invite you just to speak to that caterpillar self within all of us, right? And to remind it that we need to listen to this voice within, that intelligence that has guided our lives. And when it's telling you that it's time for something new, may we be courageous enough to weave our cocoon and have hope for what tomorrow holds.